In the winter of 1987, the city of Chicago carried its usual mixture of grit and rhythm, a place where snow piled against sidewalks, where the hum of elevated trains blended with the distant wail of sirens, and where neighborhoods each held their own stories. Among these streets lived a pair of identical twin brothers, born only minutes apart, yet often described as if they were one person split in two. They were in their late teens, tall, lanky, with sharp features that mirrored one another so perfectly that even close friends sometimes confused them. Their family, like many in the city, worked long hours to make ends meet. Their father was a machinist at a factory on the south side, often returning home with oil-stained hands, while their mother managed shifts at a diner, known by locals for pouring coffee as steadily as she listened to the endless chatter of regulars. The twins had grown up in this modest household, sharing a cramped bedroom with two narrow beds pressed against opposite walls, though more often than not they fell asleep talking until the early hours, their conversations bridging the space between them. They were known in the neighborhood as inseparable, not only because they looked alike, but because they moved through the world like a unit, walking side by side to school, joining the same basketball games at the park, even gravitating toward the same small circle of friends. Their bond was ordinary in one sense, as many twins are close, but in another sense, it was intense, almost unnerving. Teachers at school sometimes joked that asking one brother a question was like asking them both, since their answers often echoed each other. It was within this ordinary, working-class life, against the backdrop of a city alive with steel, snow, and stories, that something extraordinary would soon unfold. From their earliest memories, the twins had lived as though bound by an invisible thread, one that kept them moving in rhythm with each other. As children, they built forts out of cardboard boxes in the basement, drawing secret maps and pretending they were explorers charting the unknown. By the time they reached high school, that same sense of shared adventure carried into their daily lives. Both enrolled in the same classes, not because of scheduling convenience, but because neither wanted to be apart. Teachers often remarked on how one seemed to finish the other's thoughts during group discussions, as though their minds were tuned to the same channel. On weekends, they played basketball at the neighborhood park, usually joining the same team, passing the ball back and forth with an uncanny sense of anticipation that left their opponents frustrated. Their small circle of friends accepted them as a pair. Inviting one meant the other was coming too. Even in arguments, which were rare, the tension never lasted long. A quiet understanding always pulled them back together. At home, their shared room became a reflection of their unity. Posters of the same rock bands on both walls, stacks of comic books arranged neatly in a corner, and a single cassette player they traded back and forth without quarrel. They found joy in the same hobbies, from sketching cartoons in their notebooks to tinkering with their father's old tools in the garage. Though occasionally teased by classmates for being joined at the hip, they carried themselves with quiet confidence, unbothered by how others perceived them. To those who knew them, their closeness seemed natural, if not entirely unusual. But beneath this harmony, something deeper, something far less ordinary, was beginning to stir, waiting to reveal itself in ways none of them could have predicted. It happened on an otherwise ordinary morning, the kind where the frost clung stubbornly to the windows and the smell of their mother's coffee drifted through the narrow kitchen. The twins sat across from each other at the small table, bleary-eyed, their bowls of cereal untouched. One of them broke the silence first, pushing his spoon lazily against the milk. He said he'd had a dream the night before, something strange, wandering through an abandoned building, its hallways long and crumbling, filled with peeling paint and broken glass that glittered like ice in the dim light. Before he could continue, the other twin froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. His eyes narrowed, and he asked him to describe it again. Details tumbled out. The sagging staircase, the flicker of a single hanging bulb, the hollow echo of their footsteps in the empty corridors. Each description seemed to unlock something in the other's memory, until he finally blurted out that he had dreamed the very same thing. The realization left them both stunned. They exchanged a look that carried more weight than words, the kind of silent communication only siblings could master. At first, they laughed nervously, brushing it off as some trick of chance. Maybe they had both seen the same building on television or in a movie, and their imaginations had latched onto it. But the memory felt too vivid, too real. They could recall the exact sensation of cold air against their skin, the sound of glass crunching under their shoes, and even the faint smell of mildew that hung in the dream like a shadow. The unease lingered as they finished breakfast in silence. By the time they left for school, walking side by side down the icy streets, both tried to dismiss the thought. Yet the image of that crumbling building refused to leave their minds. It was the first time they realized their dreams might not belong to them alone. For a few days after that strange morning, the twins treated the shared dream as nothing more than a bizarre coincidence, a quirky story to tell each other when conversation drifted. They joked about it while walking to school, nudging each other and claiming they had psychic powers, their laughter echoing down the block. One of their friends overheard and asked what was so funny, and the twins casually explained the abandoned building dream. Their friend rolled his eyes, shrugged, and told them it was probably because they watched the same late-night TV shows. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, and the twins accepted it outwardly, letting the subject drop whenever others were around. Still, late at night, when the house was quiet and only the hum of the radiator filled their room, they found themselves returning to the subject in whispers. They tested each other, recounting the dream detail by detail, marveling at how every element matched. But then, with the same nervous laughter, they would dismiss it again, insisting it had to be a trick of memory, some overlap caused by living side by side every day of their lives. Their mother, overhearing fragments of their talk, scolded them for letting their imaginations run wild, reminding them they had real responsibilities, chores, school, helping their father with errands. The twins nodded obediently, but the strangeness lingered in the background of their thoughts. By convincing themselves it was nothing, they found a fragile comfort, an excuse to move on. Yet beneath their laughter and mockery, a quiet unease remained. Neither could shake the feeling that what had happened was more than mere chance. They didn't know it yet, but this first attempt at dismissal was the last time they would be able to laugh so easily about their dreams. In the weeks that followed, the dreams began to multiply. What started as a single coincidence unfolded into a pattern that neither twin could ignore. One morning, one of them awoke unsettled, remembering a dream about standing at the edge of the Chicago River at night, watching the lights of the city ripple across the black water. He mentioned it casually over breakfast, only to see his brother's expression harden. The other had dreamt the same thing, the same bitter wind, the same reflection of a passing train's headlights, even the sensation of damp shoes from standing too close to the edge. Another night brought them both into a crowded diner filled with faceless figures. They remembered the hiss of a jukebox that played a song neither of them recognized, but could both hum perfectly when they woke. The details weren't just similar, they were identical, down to exact fragments of conversation overheard in their dreams. "The coffee's cold," one faceless man had muttered, and both brothers repeated the line in unison when they realized they had heard it too. At first, they tried to explain it away as shared influence. Maybe one had described the dream in his sleep, and the other had absorbed it. Maybe it was all suggestion, imagination bleeding across the thin line that separated them. But the accuracy was too sharp, too complete. Even their body language changed. In waking life, they began finishing each other's sentences more often, not by accident, but with eerie precision, as though rehearsed. Their teachers started noticing how answers in class from one twin matched the whispered thoughts of the other. Their small circle of friends began to tease them more openly, calling them the echo. Yet when the lights were off at night, lying in their narrow beds, neither brother laughed. Instead, they whispered to each other about the next dream that would surely come, both dreading and anticipating what they might see next. The strangeness became too much to ignore, and so the twins decided to keep records. One evening, after yet another night of identical dreams, One of them pulled an old spiral notebook from a school bag and suggested they start writing everything down. His brother agreed immediately. They set rules. Each would write in secret as soon as they woke up, without speaking to each other, and only later would they compare. The first morning they tried it, the result left them silent. Both had scrawled nearly the same description: long hallway, red door at the end, smell of smoke in the air. Their handwriting was different, but the words seemed copied. They stared at the pages, their unease deepening. They continued this ritual day after day. The notebooks began to fill with overlapping imagery: abandoned lots, empty trains, faceless strangers, sudden storms. Sometimes entire sentences matched, as though dictated to them by the same invisible voice. One morning, they both recorded a dream about being chased through an alley by a pack of stray dogs. Not only were the details identical, the sound of snarls, the scrape of claws on pavement, but even the fear written into their entries pulsed with the same urgency. They showed the journals to their parents, who frowned at the pages. Their mother thought they were playing some elaborate prank, while their father told them to cut it out and focus on schoolwork. But the twins knew the truth. Neither had copied the other. They had proof in ink and paper that something impossible was happening. Over time, the journals became sacred objects, evidence of the invisible bond they were beginning to fear. Each morning, when they flipped open the covers to compare entries, their hands trembled slightly, not knowing what they would uncover, not knowing if the next dream might reveal something darker than either wanted to face. At first, the family brushed off the twins' claims as childish exaggeration, but soon the weight of their stories began to creep into the household. Over dinners at the cramped kitchen table, the boys would exchange fragments of their latest dreams, their words tumbling over one another as they described the same places, the same events, even the same feelings. Their younger sister, too young to understand, would giggle nervously and accuse them of rehearsing, but their parents grew less amused. One evening, when the boys described standing on a rusted fire escape overlooking a street they had never visited, their mother set her fork down sharply, her face pale. She demanded to know if they were sneaking out at night, suspecting mischief rather than mystery. Both swore they hadn't left their beds. Their father, a man of few words, grew irritated, muttering that they were filling their heads with nonsense from horror movies and comic books. But the unease lingered. Their mother, who had always prided herself on knowing her sons inside and out, found herself rattled by the eerie precision of their shared accounts. Once, she overheard them in their room, comparing journals, repeating the same lines about a room with no windows and a ticking clock, and her hands trembled as she folded laundry nearby. It was too exact, too rehearsed, except she knew they hadn't had time to rehearse. Relatives who visited during the holidays noticed it too. An aunt commented that the boys had grown strange, always whispering to each other, finishing sentences as if speaking with one mouth. The family atmosphere shifted. Conversations turned cautious, the subject of dreams avoided as much as possible. Yet the twins could not stop themselves. Each morning, their voices carried through the thin walls of the house, recounting impossible similarities, forcing their family to face the question no one wanted to ask aloud. What if the boys were telling the truth? The first time the figure appeared, the twins nearly convinced themselves it was nothing. In their journals, both described the same detail. A man standing at the end of a corridor, tall, broad-shouldered, with the brim of a dark hat casting his face in shadow. He did not move, did not speak, simply lingered there as if waiting. When they compared notes the next morning, they laughed uneasily, telling each other it was probably just their minds inventing the same cliché villain, like something from comic book. But as nights passed, the man returned. Sometimes he appeared in the distance, barely visible, his outline framed in a doorway. Other times he stood closer, so near that they could feel the weight of his presence. His silence was worse than any words. He never chased, never attacked, yet his stillness radiated menace, as though he knew something they didn't. The journals filled with sketches of him, crude drawings of his tall frame, the slouch of his shoulders, the way his hat seemed too large, swallowing what should have been his face. Both brothers drew him the same way, without consulting each other. Their mother found one of the sketches once while cleaning and scolded them for frightening themselves with nonsense. But the boys couldn't dismiss him. The most disturbing detail came when they realized he was not confined to one dream. Whether they were in the endless hotel, the riverbank, or the alleyways of that strange dream city, the man appeared somewhere in the background, always silent, always watching. One twin confessed to the other that, even awake, he sometimes felt the man's eyes on him, though he had never seen his face. The other admitted the same. And so the figure became a constant in their lives, a shadow crossing the thin boundary between dream and reality. One night, the dream shifted from the familiar landscapes of empty buildings and shadowed corridors into something disturbingly clear. Both twins awoke, gasping, their journals filled with frantic handwriting. They had stood together at a Chicago intersection they knew well, a busy crossing near their school, where the elevated tracks rattled above and traffic snarled daily. In the dream, the night air was heavy with snow, street lamps casting pale halos across the slick pavement. They both saw it, a dark sedan speeding through the intersection, striking a smaller car that spun violently into a lamppost. Glass exploded like shards of ice, screams echoed, and then everything went still. What haunted them most was not just the scene itself, but the sound, the metallic crunch of impact, repeated in their ears even after they woke. They compared notes immediately, their descriptions nearly identical. Fear settled over them, but they tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the dream was just a reflection of their environment, a subconscious fear of Chicago's chaotic traffic. They wanted to believe it. Yet 3 days later, walking home from school, they stopped dead in their tracks. At the very intersection from their dream, flashing lights painted the street red and blue. Police cars blocked the road, an ambulance wailed, and a dark sedan sat wrecked against a lamppost. The smaller car's frame was twisted beyond recognition, its windows shattered into glittering fragments scattered across the street. The twins stood silently, their stomachs lurching as they recognized the scene. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. The same angle of the crash car, the same bent lamppost, even the same eerie silence that followed the chaos. For the first time, they could not dismiss their dreams as coincidence or imagination. The impossible had happened. They had both seen the future, and it had come to pass. The story of the twins' dreams might have remained a secret within the walls of their modest home, but Chicago in the late 80s was a city of tight-knit neighborhoods where whispers traveled faster than the L trains. One evening, after the accident at the intersection, a neighbor overheard the boys speaking in hushed tones on the front steps, nervously remarking that they had seen it days earlier in a dream. The neighbor, half curious and half amused, shared the tale with another on the block. Soon, small conversations at corner stores and laundromats carried the story further. Did you hear about the twins? The ones who dreamed the same thing. At first, people treated it as an oddity, something to chuckle over while waiting for the bus. But when others recalled the accident and connected it to what the twins had supposedly predicted, curiosity sharpened into intrigue. Parents warned their children not to tease the brothers at school, while some adults quietly encouraged them to dream something useful. By winter's end, the twins had become neighborhood legends. It wasn't long before a local reporter caught wind of the story. Chicago's community papers often thrived on unusual tales, and this one was irresistible. Two teenage boys who claimed to share dreams, and sometimes glimpses of the future. The reporter visited their house one Saturday, notebook in hand, and coaxed the twins into recounting their journals, the abandoned buildings, the man in the hat, and the car accident. Their parents looked uncomfortable but didn't stop them. A week later, the article appeared, tucked between stories of rising crime and city politics. The headline was simple but striking. Chicago twins claim to dream as one. The piece drew more attention than anyone expected. Neighbors clipped it for keepsakes. Strangers called the family's phone asking questions. And suddenly the twins' private strangeness had become public. The boys could no longer pretend their lives were ordinary. As word of the twins spread beyond the neighborhood and into academic circles, opinions divided sharply. The psychologists who had conducted the first structure tests leaned toward cautious explanations. In their view, the boys' closeness, their shared environment, routines, and even the way they processed daily experiences could have led to overlapping dream material. They argued that siblings often internalized similar images and memories, and that identical twins, with nearly indistinguishable genetics, might naturally drift toward the same subconscious imagery. To them, the phenomenon was remarkable but not supernatural. Yet others disagreed. The parapsychologists who had crowded into the boys' small bedroom, hovering over their journals, saw the case as proof of something extraordinary. They spoke confidently about twin telepathy, a supposed psychic link that allowed one mind to transmit impressions directly into the other. Their theories went further still. Perhaps the boys were not merely sharing dreams, but glimpsing fragments of the future together. The car accident became their central piece of evidence, cited again and again as undeniable proof of precognition. Newspapers picked up on the debate, fueling public fascination. One article quoted a respected sleep researcher who dismissed the claims as suggestion and imagination, while another featured a parapsychologist insisting the twins were living proof that human consciousness extended beyond the limits of the brain. Neighbors and strangers alike began choosing sides. Some whispered that the boys were liars, enjoying their moment of fame. Others believed fervently, treating them almost like prophets. Caught in the middle, the twins listened to the adults argue over their lives, their experiences dissected as though they were exhibits in a museum. The conflicting voices only deepened their confusion. Were they victims of chance, products of psychology, or participants in something far stranger? By the spring of 1987, the dreams had grown darker, sharper, more vivid than ever before. One night, both twins found themselves standing inside a theater they had never seen before. The place was alive with noise, the murmur of conversations, the rustle of coats, the sharp smell of buttered popcorn drifting through the air. They described velvet seats stretching out in neat rows, the ornate molding of the ceiling, and the flickering glow of the projector casting shadows on the walls. It should have been comforting, almost ordinary, but beneath the surface was a current of unease neither of them could ignore. As the dream unfolded, the unease transformed into horror. A sudden spark, they both saw it, near the stage lights, followed by smoke curling upward like a living thing. At first, no one seemed to notice, but the twins did. They shouted warnings, their voices lost in the din. Then the fire spread with terrifying speed, flames racing across curtains, swallowing wooden beams, filling the air with choking black smoke. Screams erupted, the crowd surged in panic. People stumbled over one another, clawing toward the exits. The twins remembered the sound most vividly, the roar of fire mingling with the cries of trapped voices. They woke at the same moment, drenched in sweat, hearts pounding, the phantom smell of smoke still clinging to their senses. When they opened their journals, they didn't even need to compare. Each knew the other had seen the same thing. But when they did, the details were nearly identical, written in frantic, shaky lines. The image of flames reflected in a gilded ceiling, the shape of a collapsed balcony, the heat pressing against their skin. This dream was different from the others. It wasn't just eerie, it was catastrophic, the kind of nightmare that left them trembling long after dawn. For the first time, the twins felt genuine terror not only of what they had seen, but of what it might mean if the dream, like the car accident, was done. The dream clung to the twins for days, gnawing at their nerves with each passing hour. They avoided theaters entirely, even turning down an invitation from classmates to see a new release downtown. Their journals remained open on their desks. The words fire and smoke circled again and again, as though repetition might strip the fear away. But nothing could quiet the dread. They whispered to each other before sleep, asking, "What if it happens tonight? What if we're supposed to stop it?" Then, 4 nights later, the headline appeared in the Chicago Tribune. Cinema Fire Forces Evacuation. No injuries reported. The article described a small blaze that had broken out in a neighborhood theater not far from their own, started by faulty wiring near the stage lights. Patrons had smelled smoke, the alarms rang, and everyone had been ushered out before the flames spread. No one was hurt, though the building sustained heavy damage. The twins stared at the story in stunned silence. Every detail, the location near the stage, the billowing smoke, the frightened crowd, echoed what they had seen in their shared nightmare. And though this fire hadn't claimed lives like the vision in their sleep, it was enough to convince them that their dreams were not simply tricks of the mind. Something was happening that defied explanation. Their parents tried to soothe them, insisting it was coincidence, but the boys knew better. They felt a creeping certainty that the dreams weren't random flickers of imagination. They were warnings. Yet that realization brought no comfort. If the car accident had been real, and the fire had now happened too, then what else might unfold from the strange world of their sleep? Were they destined to watch these visions come true again and again, powerless to prevent them? The brothers began to wonder if the fire had been only a glimpse of something larger, a shadow of a disaster still waiting in the wings. The fire confirmed what the twins had most dreaded. Their dreams could no longer be brushed aside as coincidence. If small warnings could take shape in reality, what about the larger, more terrible visions? The thought hollowed them out with dread. They began to avoid sleep, staying up late with the TV humming in the background, fighting off the pull of dreams as if closing their eyes meant inviting disaster. Their parents scolded them for looking tired and restless, but the boys could not explain the weight pressing on them. How could they? Who would believe that slumber itself had become a battlefield? At school, classmates whispered more than ever. Some treated the twins like curiosities, asking them to predict lottery numbers or upcoming pop quizzes. Others kept their distance, muttering that they were cursed. Even their teachers glanced at them oddly, aware of the article and the neighborhood gossip. The twins felt the walls closing in, as though their lives had been reduced to a single question. What will you dream next? But it wasn't fascination they carried, it was terror. Each new dream threatened to show them horrors they had no power to change. If they foresaw a plane crash, a fire, or another accident, what could two teenage boys do? Call the police and be dismissed as pranksters? Stand in the street, shouting warnings like prophets ignored? The helplessness gnawed at them more than the visions themselves. They began to argue in whispers, one insisting that perhaps they were meant to intervene, the other convinced they were powerless spectators. Neither answer offered peace. Nights turned colder as 1987 wore on, and with every dream scribbled into their journals, they wondered if fate was tightening its grip, using them as unwilling messengers of tragedies still to come. By summer, the line between fascination and fear in the community tipped towards something darker. What began as whispers about the dreaming twins hardened into superstition. At school, classmates avoided sitting near them, sliding their desks away as though proximity might invite misfortune. Some whispered insults, cursed, bad luck, even devil kids. Others refused to make eye contact, crossing themselves when the brothers passed in the hallway. The isolation bit deeply. The boys, once inseparable from their small circle of friends, now found themselves eating lunch alone, their trays pushed to the far corner of the cafeteria. Invitations to play basketball after class stopped arriving. Even teachers, though more discreet, seemed uneasy. When the fire at the cinema made its way into conversation, glances inevitably flicked toward the twins, as though they had conjured it into being rather than simply dreamt it. The neighborhood, too, shifted in its treatment of them. Some adults locked their doors when the twins walked by. A few mothers tugged their children closer, muttering that the boys brought bad omens. The sense of belonging that had anchored them in the South Side began to dissolve, leaving only suspicion in its place. At home, their parents tried to shield them, insisting the world would move on, that people always chased the newest rumor. But the twins knew otherwise. Their shared dreams had become their identity, the single fact by which others defined them. Isolation was no longer a choice. It was imposed. Together, They clung to each other more tightly than ever, but even that bond carried strain. For in the silence of their room, beneath the weight of their journals, each twin secretly wondered, was it true? Were they cursed? Isolation only made the twins more determined to understand what was happening to them. If the outside world saw them as cursed, then perhaps the answer lay in the pages of their journals, the only place where their experiences could be compared without interruption, without judgment. Every night, no matter how exhausted or frightened, they wrote. The entries became longer, filled with frantic sketches of places and faces, scrawled arrows pointing to repeated symbols, underlined words that seemed important but never revealed their meaning. Their room transformed into a kind of archive. Stacks of spiral notebooks filled with careful handwriting leaned against the walls. They tore pages from some and pinned them up, trying to make a map of their dreams. Certain details recurred again and again. A man in a hat standing in shadow, the silhouette of an elevated train, the faint glow of neon letters that neither could fully read. At first, these fragments seemed meaningless. But when events like the car accident and the cinema fire unfolded after appearing in their dreams, the boys began to treat every scribble as a potential warning. They argued about the symbols. One insisted they were codes, signs meant to be interpreted and acted upon. The other believed they were glimpses of inevitable moments, images of a future already set in motion. Either way, they felt an urgency that bordered on obsession. They spent hours hunched over the notebooks, comparing last night's entry with one from weeks earlier, tracing lines between events with trembling fingers. Still, the harder they searched for patterns, the less clarity they found. Each discovery only opened another question, another possibility, and the weight of knowing, or thinking they might know, began to crush them. For every repeated image, they could not help but wonder, is this tomorrow's tragedy? And if so, what can we possibly do to stop it? It happened on a muggy night in late July, when the city air hung heavy and restless. Both twins slipped into sleep reluctantly, their journals already waiting at their bedsides. What they saw that night froze them to their cores. They dreamt of their own street, quiet under a pale, flickering street lamp. The cracked sidewalks, the leaning telephone poles, even the rusted cars parked along the curb were rendered in exact, chilling detail. And then he appeared, the man in the hat. He was no longer a shadow in some distant alley or a figure glimpsed in passing. This time, he was walking with deliberate steps toward their very house. His hat was low, hiding his face, but his posture radiated intent. In the dream, the boys could hear his shoes striking the pavement, the sharp rhythm echoing through the night. He paused once beneath the street lamp, tilting his head upward as though he knew they were watching. Then, without hesitation, he ascended the steps of their porch. One twin swore he heard the creak of the wooden boards. The other insisted he saw the glint of a hand reaching for the doorknob. Both woke at the same moment, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The dream had felt more vivid than any before, as if the barrier between sleep and waking had thinned to nothing. Their journals shook in their hands as they scribbled the same images. The lamplight, the footsteps, the hand at the door. Unlike the car accident or the fire, this vision was not of strangers in distant places. It was personal. It was here. The figure who had haunted the edges of their shared dreams for months was no longer lingering in the shadows of memory or imagination. He was coming closer, step by step, and now he had found his way to their home. The twins stared at each other in silence, both too afraid to speak the question they shared. What happens if he comes inside? The night of the man in the hat marked a turning point. Before, their dreams had been frightening, sometimes tragic, but always at a distance. Accidents, fires, faceless crowds. Now, the horror was at their very doorstep. Both twins woke trembling, their bodies refusing to calm, even after dawn poured through the blinds. They told themselves it had only been a dream, but every sound in the house betrayed them. The groan of the floorboards, the faint knock of tree branches against the window, even the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Each noise became the echo of his footsteps, the creak of him mounting the porch. When night returned, Neither boy wanted to close his eyes. They tried reading, whispering to each other, even begging their parents to let them keep the lights on. Their mothers scolded them gently, brushing it off as childish fear. But the twins knew. They knew the man in the hat was different from all the other visions. He wasn't tied to some external disaster. He was tethered to them. Exhaustion took its toll quickly. The less they slept, the more frayed their minds became. At school, their eyes burned red, their hands shook as they wrote in class. Teachers assumed they were staying up late with television or mischief, unaware of the gnawing dread that hollowed them out each night. When it had finally collapsed into sleep, it was never restful. They would jolt awake in the middle of the night, convinced they had heard a knock at the door, or worse, the scrape of a key turning in the lock. The journals, once tools of order and curiosity, began to feel like chains. Each page filled with frantic handwriting, scrawled lines of "He's coming. He's closer. He knows us." The dreams had stolen their peace of mind, and now even waking life no longer felt safe. Sleep had become a trap, and the man in the hat was waiting at the center of it. At last, unable to carry the burden alone, the twins broke their silence. One evening, while the family sat around the dinner table, they exchanged a nervous glance and began to speak. Their voices wavered as they described the dream. The man in the hat walking down their street, climbing their porch steps, reaching for the door. They emphasized the vividness, how it felt more like memory than imagination. Their journals, filled with sketches of the figure and frantic lines of text, were placed on the table like evidence in a trial. Their parents listened patiently at first, but unease soon turned to exasperation. Their mother shook her head, reminding them that they had been under unusual pressure since the newspaper article and the visits from academics. "It's stress," she said firmly, "and stress makes the mind invent monsters." Their father agreed, telling them that fear could play tricks, especially when dreams became the center of one's life. "You boys are feeding this thing," he added. "The more you write it down, the more real it feels." The twins tried to protest. They spoke of the car accident, of the fire, of the way their dreams had already stepped into waking reality. But the words fell flat against their parents' skeptical expressions. To them, it was all coincidence and imagination, nothing more. Dismissed, the boys withdrew in silence, frustration simmering beneath their fear. If their own parents would not believe them, who would? That night, as they lay in the dark, the weight of disbelief pressed harder than ever. The man in the hat was still out there, somewhere between dream and reality, and now the twins knew they had no protection. Not from science, not from their classmates, not even from the people who loved them most. They were alone in their terror, waiting for the next time he came to their door.